The afternoon sun was trying its hardest to break through the thick, gray clouds that hung over the city, but inside the Galleria, it was always perfect. The air was cool and smelled like expensive perfume and fresh coffee. This wasn't just any mall. It was the kind of place where people didn't come to buy socks or groceries. They came here to buy things that most people only saw in magazines. The floors were made of white marble that were so shiny you could see your reflection in them as you walked. Every step you took echoed, reminding you that you were somewhere important, in the center of this huge building. Right under the glass ceiling that let in whatever light the day offered, sat a grand piano. It was a beautiful, shiny black monster of an instrument. It looked brand new, like it had just rolled out of a factory. It sat there all alone on a small round stage, waiting for someone who knew how to make it sing. It wasn't just for show, though. The management liked to have classical music playing softly in the background, to make the shoppers feel fancy while they spent thousands of dollars on handbags and watches. Richard was the man in charge of this whole floor. He was the manager of the luxury wing, and he took his job very seriously. Richard was wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. It was tailored perfectly to his body, and his tie was knotted so tight it looked like it might be choking him just a little bit. He walked back and forth across the marble floor, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He was a man on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Today was a huge day for Richard. A VIP client was coming in. This wasn't just any rich person. This was a buyer from overseas who was looking to spend a massive amount of money on jewelry. Richard had spent weeks planning this visit. The flowers had been arranged just right. The lighting was adjusted to make the diamonds sparkle the most. And, most importantly, he had booked the best pianist in the city to play live music from 2 o'clock until 4 o'clock. He needed everything to be flawless. He needed the atmosphere to be calm, rich, and sophisticated. But if you looked closely at Richard's face, you could see the panic setting in. He was sweating just a little bit right above his eyebrow. He kept checking his phone, then looking at the door, then checking his phone again. Where is he? Richard muttered to himself, stopping in front of a tall display of crystal vases. He tapped his foot impatiently on the floor. The pianist was 20 minutes late. In the world of high-end retail, being on time meant being 5 minutes early. Being 20 minutes late was a disaster. Richard walked over to the security guard who was standing near the elevators. Looking bored with his arms crossed, "Has anyone seen Mr. Henderson?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The pianist. The guard shook his head slowly. "No, sir. Haven't seen anyone with an instrument case come through the main doors." Richard let out a long, frustrated breath and ran a hand through his gelled hair. This couldn't be happening. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number again. It went straight to voicemail. A generic robotic voice told him to leave a message, but Richard just snapped the phone shut. He didn't have time for messages. The silence in the atrium was starting to bother him. It was too quiet. You could hear the distinct click-clack of high heels and the low murmur of people talking, but there was no music. Without the piano, the place didn't feel magical. It just felt like a big, expensive hallway. He could feel the headache starting to throb behind his eyes. He had promised the VIP client a full sensory experience. He didn't think listening to the escalator hum was what they had in mind. He looked around at the shoppers. There was a woman trying on a coat that looked like it was made of gold thread. There was a man adjusting his cufflinks near the entrance. They all looked like they belonged there. They looked like they had money. They expected a show. Richard felt like he was standing on a stage with his pants down. The perfection of the image he had built was cracking, just because of one missing musician. "Okay, think," Richard whispered to himself. He looked at the empty bench in front of the shiny black piano. It looked lonely. It looked like a challenge. He paced back toward the piano, his shoes making sharp sounds on the floor. He wondered if he should call the agency. No, that would take too long. They would send someone, but it would be hours. His VIP was due in 40 minutes. He needed music now. Maybe he could play a recording over the speakers. No, that sounded cheap. That sounded like a grocery store. The clients would notice. They always noticed. They had ears like bats for anything that wasn't authentic. Richard stopped pacing and stood next to the piano. He placed a hand on the smooth, cool wood. It felt solid. He wished he knew how to play. He wished he could just sit down and bang out a song himself. But the only thing he knew how to play was the radio. The stress was making him angry. It wasn't fair. He had planned everything. He had organized every little detail, and now one flaky musician was going to ruin his reputation. He imagined the VIP walking in, looking around at the silent room and frowning. He imagined them turning around and walking right back out, taking their millions of dollars with them. The thought made Richard's stomach churn. He looked up at the glass ceiling. The clouds outside were darkening. It looked like it might rain soon. The weather was matching his mood perfectly. He felt a drop of sweat run down the side of his face. He quickly wiped it away with a silk handkerchief from his pocket. He had to keep up appearances. Even if he was panicking on the inside, on the outside, he had to look like the man who had everything under control. "Excuse me," a voice said. Richard spun around, startled. A shopper was standing there holding a bag. "Is there going to be music today?" "Usually there's a pianist at this time." Richard forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, madam. Just a small intermission. The music will resume shortly." The woman looked skeptical, but walked away, toward the elevators. Richard let the smile drop as soon as her back was turned. He was running out of time. He was running out of excuses. The grand piano sat there, silent and mocking him. It was a beautiful object that was currently useless to him because he didn't have the right person to operate it. He felt trapped. He needed a miracle, or at the very least, he needed a musician to walk through the doors in the next 2 minutes. He took a deep breath and straightened his tie. He decided to wait by the entrance. He would stand there like a guard until someone showed up. It was the only plan he had left. He marched toward the glass doors, his mind racing with excuses and backup plans, none of them good. The silence of the mall pressed against his ears, loud and heavy, reminding him that something was missing. Outside the heavy glass doors of the Galleria, the wind was howling. It cut right through clothes, no matter how many layers you were wearing. The city was freezing, a sharp, biting kind of cold that made your nose run and your fingers feel stiff and numb. It was the kind of afternoon where people rushed from their warm cars to warm buildings with their heads down. Not wanting to spend a single second more in the weather than they absolutely had to, Leo stood on the sidewalk. Pressed up against the cold brick wall of the building next door, he wasn't wearing a fancy coat. In fact, his coat was barely a coat at all. It was a thick green hoodie that had seen better days. The cotton was pilling in little balls, and the waistband was fraying. He wore it pulled up over his head, trying to keep his ears warm, but the wind still found a way in. His sneakers were old and beat up, the rubber soles worn thin from miles of walking. With every step he took, he could feel the cold seeping up from the sidewalk through the bottoms of his feet. Leo shivered and shoved. His fingers were icy cold. He curled them into fists to try to generate a little heat, but it wasn't working. He needed to get inside. Just for a few minutes. Just long enough to stop shaking. He had been walking for hours, running small errands for people in the neighborhood just to scrape together a few dollars. But the work had dried up when the weather turned bad. He looked up at the building beside him. It was the Galleria. He knew what this place was. Everyone in the city knew. It was where the rich people went. Through the thick glass, he could see golden light pouring out. It looked warm inside. It looked like a different world. He hesitated for a moment. He knew he didn't look like he belonged there. He knew that security guards usually watched kids like him very closely, just waiting for them to step out of line. But the wind whipped a gust of freezing air right into his face, and the decision was made for him. He couldn't feel his toes anymore. He had to go in. Leo took a deep breath and pushed the heavy metal handle of the door. For a second, nothing happened. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. He leaned his shoulder into it and pushed harder. With a sudden whoosh, the door gave way, and the sound of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by the soft, quiet hum of the mall. The warmth hit him like a wall. It was amazing. It was heated air, probably smelling a little bit like cinnamon and expensive leather. Leo stepped inside and let the door swing shut behind him. He just stood there for a moment, his eyes closed, letting the feeling come back into his face. He didn't move. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. He just wanted to be invisible, to soak up the heat without anyone noticing him was there. When he finally opened his eyes, he blinked a few times to adjust to the bright light. The inside was even more impressive than it looked from the outside. The ceiling was incredibly high, made of glass and white metal, letting in the gray afternoon light but making it look soft and pretty. The floor was so shiny it looked wet. Leo looked down at his own dirty sneakers and instinctively scuffed his feet on the mat inside the door. Trying to hide the marks on the floor, even though he knew it was hopeless, he started walking slowly, keeping his head down but looking around. He saw stores with names he didn't recognize, but the windows were full of things that sparkled. Diamonds, gold watches, handbags made of skin that looked softer than anything he had ever touched. He saw people walking past. The women were dressed like they were going to a party, and the men wore suits that fit perfectly. Nobody looked like him. Everyone here looked like they had somewhere important to be, money in their pockets to spend when they got there. Leo kept his hands buried deep in his hoodie pocket. He felt a pang of shame in his chest. He knew people were looking at him. He could feel their eyes on him like spotlights. A security guard standing near a kiosk watched him closely. Leo quickly turned away, pretending to look at a display of scarves in a window, but he wasn't really seeing the prices. He was just trying to look busy. He felt like a tiny, dirty speck in a pristine, clean world. He walked a little further, just wandering, letting the warmth sink into his bones. He wasn't planning to steal anything. He wasn't planning to cause trouble. He just wanted to exist in a warm place for 10 minutes. That was his only goal. Then he saw it. In the middle of the huge open floor, there was a large open space, and right in the center of it sat a piano. It was the biggest piano Leo had ever seen in real life. It was a grand piano, black as midnight, with the lid propped open. It was sitting on a small platform that was carpeted in red. It looked lonely. It looked majestic. Leo stopped walking. He forgot about the cold. He forgot about the people staring at his hoodie. His eyes locked onto the instrument. He had loved music for as long as he could remember. Music was the only thing that made him feel like he wasn't just a poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks. At his school, there was an old, beat-up, upright piano in the back of the auditorium. The keys were yellowed, and some of them stuck when you pressed them. But Leo would sit there for hours whenever he could, picking out tunes. Teaching himself how to move his fingers. He didn't know how to read music very well. He couldn't afford lessons. But he had ears. He could hear a song once and his fingers just knew what to do. He would watch videos on the library computer, pausing and rewinding. Watching the hands of the masters until his own hands ached. That dusty old piano at school was his escape. It was the place where he could be powerful, where he could be beautiful, where he could be something else. Seeing this piano, this gleaming, perfect instrument, was like seeing a superhero in real life. It was intimidating, but it pulled him in like a magnet. He took a step toward it, then another. He forgot about the security guard. He forgot about the manager pacing on the other side of the room. All he could see was the black and white keys. He got closer. The red carpet cushioned his worn-out sneakers. He stood at the edge of the platform, just looking at it. It looked brand new, not a speck of dust on it. The wood reflected the lights above. He wondered what it would sound like. A piano this expensive, this big, it had to sound like heaven. Leo reached out a hand, then pulled it back. He knew the rules. You don't touch things that aren't yours, especially not things that cost more than your parents' house. He looked around nervously. The manager was far away, looking at his watch. The shoppers were busy looking at themselves. The security guard was looking at a phone, just one touch, he thought, just to feel the keys. To see if they are as smooth as they look. He climbed the 2 steps up onto the platform. The air up here felt different, somehow charged with energy. He walked slowly around to the side of the bench. The bench was upholstered in black leather, tufted with little buttons. It looked too fancy to sit on. Leo stood there for a long moment, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. He wasn't a nervous kid anymore. He was a musician standing before an instrument. The distance between his life and the life of the people in this mall seemed to disappear. In front of a piano, everyone was the same. It was just you and the music. He took a deep breath and slowly pulled his right hand out of his pocket. His fingers were still a little pink from the cold outside. He reached out toward the keys, hovering his hand just above them. He could feel the vibration of the room, the silence waiting to be broken. He didn't want to play a concert. He didn't want to show off. He just wanted to connect. He wanted to feel that connection that he only felt when he was playing. The manager in the distance suddenly turned around. His eyes swept across the floor and landed on the platform. He saw the green hoodie. He saw the dirty sneakers on the red carpet. And he saw the hand reaching for the piano. The expression on the manager's face changed instantly from worry to anger. He started moving toward the platform, walking fast, but Leo didn't see him coming. Leo was in a trance. He let his fingers descend. They were millimeters away from the ivory keys, yearning to press down, to make a sound, to bring the silent giant to life. He was just a boy who loved music, standing in a palace he wasn't allowed to enter, about to break the silence in the most beautiful way he knew how. The heavy sound of dress shoes pounding against the marble floor broke the silence. It wasn't a running sound, but the fast, aggressive walk of someone who owns the ground they walk on. Richard was moving across the atrium with a target locked in his sights. He didn't care about the shoppers he had to weave past. He just wanted to get to the red platform before the disaster happened. From a distance, the boy looked like a smudge on a perfect painting. In the middle of all the bright lights and expensive glass, the green hoodie stood out like a sore thumb. Richard felt his blood pressure rising with every step. It wasn't just that the boy was loitering. It was where he was standing. He was standing right next to the most expensive item in the entire lobby. His hand was reaching out. Richard had seen it 1,000,000 times before. Kids running around, bumping into things, touching merchandise they had no business touching. But this was different. This was a concert grand piano. If that kid scratched the lid, or if he had something sticky on his hands and ruined the finish, it would be a nightmare. And if he started banging on the keys like a monkey, the peaceful atmosphere Richard was trying so hard to save would be gone completely. "Hey," Richard shouted, his voice booming and echoing off the high ceiling. "Step away from there." Leo jumped as if he had been shocked. He pulled his hand back instantly and spun around, his eyes wide. The trance he had been in was shattered. He was just a kid again, small and out of place. He saw the man in the suit charging toward him, looking like a bull ready to attack. Leo's instinct was to run, but his feet felt heavy. He froze. Clutching his hands against his chest, Richard reached the bottom of the platform and marched up the 2 steps, closing the distance between them. He was breathing hard, not from the exercise, but from the stress. He towered over Leo, looking down at the boy with a mix of disgust and panic. Up close, the manager could see just how out of place Leo was. The hoodie was old, the jeans were faded, and the sneakers were covered in mud from the slush outside. Richard looked at the boy's hands. They were clean, but they were red from the cold. "What do you think you are doing?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp and loud. He didn't whisper. He wanted the boy to know he was in trouble, and he wanted the other shoppers to see that he was handling the situation. "I wasn't going to hurt it," Leo stammered. His voice was quiet, shaky. He looked down at his sneakers. "I was just looking." "I'm sorry." "Looking?" Richard laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was a scoff. He pointed a finger at the piano. "You think this is a museum exhibit? You think you can just walk up here and put your dirty hands all over it? This is a $60,000 instrument, kid. It is not a toy." A few shoppers had stopped walking to watch. A woman with a shopping bag paused, looking at the scene with mild interest. A couple nearby whispered to each other. Richard felt the eyes on him. He knew he had to be firm. He couldn't let these people think that the mall was becoming a place where street kids could roam free and touch whatever they wanted. He had to protect the brand. "I just like pianos," Leo said, brave enough to look up for just a second. "I play at my school." That made Richard pause, and then he laughed even louder. He threw his head back, shaking his head in disbelief. He crossed his arms over his chest, making himself look even bigger. It was the most ridiculous thing he had heard all day. This kid, this scruffy little boy in a worn-out hoodie, claiming to play a grand piano like this. "You play?" Richard asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You play at school? That's cute. Let me guess. Chopsticks. Maybe twinkle, twinkle, little star? You bang on the keys with one finger until the teacher tells you to stop." The people nearby chuckled politely. It was the kind of laughter that follows a joke they don't really think is funny. But they laugh because the man in the suit seems to be in charge. Leo felt his face get hot. It wasn't from the heat of the building anymore. It was from shame. He could feel the tears stinging the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He tightened his fists inside his pockets. He didn't just play chopsticks. He played real music. He played with his heart. But he knew that looking the way he did, nobody would believe him. To Richard, he was just a nuisance. He was a pest that needed to be swatted away. "I can really play," Leo insisted, his voice a little stronger this time. "I know I look like this, but I can play." Richard looked the boy up and down, shaking his head. He decided to have some fun. He was stressed about the VIP. He was angry about the missing pianist. And taking it out on this kid was making him feel powerful. He wanted to humiliate him just enough so that he would run out and never come back. "Okay, sure," Richard said, feigning surprise. He uncrossed his arms and waved his hand toward the piano bench like a game show host revealing a prize. "Go ahead, show me. If you can play, I'll pay triple." Leo blinked. "Triple. Triple," Richard repeated, a smirk spreading across his face. "Triple whatever you usually get. If you play something good, something actually worth listening to, I will give you triple the money. But if you touch it and sound terrible, which is exactly what is going to happen, you are going to turn around. Walk out those doors and never come back." Deal. It was a trap. Leo knew it was a trap. Richard knew it was a trap. Everyone watching knew it was a trap. Richard didn't expect the boy to actually play. He expected him to sit down, maybe poke a key, realize he was in over his head, and run away in embarrassment. It was a power move. Richard was betting that the fear of the crowd would be enough to scare the boy off. Leo looked around the atrium. The woman with the shopping bag was staring. The couple was watching their phones now, uninterested. The security guard was leaning against the railing, watching to see if he needed to step in. The silence stretched out. It was heavy. It was suffocating. Leo thought about the old piano at school. He thought about the way the music made him feel when he closed his eyes. He thought about the cold wind outside that he would have to go back into if he left. He looked at the manager's face, at the smug, arrogant smile that said, "You don't belong here." Something inside Leo shifted. The shame turned into a knot of determination in his stomach. He didn't care about the money. He didn't care about making a fool of himself. He just wanted to show this man that he was wrong. He wanted to fill this cold, perfect room with something real. Leo took a slow breath and nodded his head. "Deal." Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised that the boy had actually accepted. He stepped back, gesturing to the bench with a flourish. Like he was inviting a king to sit down, but his face said he was inviting a clown to perform. "Be my guest. Don't scratch the paint." Leo walked over to the bench. It felt like the longest walk of his life. His legs felt like lead, but his heart was beating fast, like a drum in a marching band. He could feel Richard's eyes burning a hole in his back. He could feel the judgment of the room pressing down on him. He sat down on the leather seat. It was soft and cushioned, much more comfortable than the cracked wooden bench at school. He looked at the keys. They were pristine, white and black, arranged in a perfect pattern. They looked so clean that he was afraid to touch them. He hesitated. His hands hovered over the keyboard, shaking just a little bit. The air in the room was completely still. The only sound was the distant hum of an elevator and the quiet breathing of the people. Watching, Richard stood with his arms crossed, his foot tapping. He was checking his watch again, counting down the seconds until the boy gave up. He was already planning the lecture he was going to give the kid about respect in private. Property. Leo placed his fingers on the keys. They were cool and smooth. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a split second to find the music in his head. And then he started. He didn't start with a simple note. He didn't test the waters. He didn't play chopsticks. He pressed his thumb down on a low E flat, and then his fingers danced up the scale. It was the opening of a complex, stormy piece of classical music. The sound that came out of that piano wasn't a clumsy bang. It was a rich, deep roar that filled the entire atrium. The notes were crisp and clear, singing out with a power that seemed impossible coming from such a small boy. Richard's foot stopped tapping. The smirk on his face froze, then cracked, then fell away completely. His eyes went wide. He stared at the boy's hands, watching them move across the keys with a speed and grace that he had never seen before. The silence of the mall was shattered, replaced by a sound so beautiful it made people stop in their tracks. The shoppers who had been ignoring the scene spun around. The woman with the shopping bag dropped her bag slightly, her mouth open in surprise. The security guard stood up straight, taking his earbud out. The music poured out of Leo, rushing through him like a river breaking through a dam. He wasn't thinking about the cold or the manager or the money. He was just playing, and it was spectacular. The sound that filled the atrium was not just music. It was a presence. It seemed to push against the glass walls and rise up to the high ceiling, filling every empty corner of the huge room. The notes were rich and full, vibrating through the floorboards and up the legs of the people standing nearby. It was a complex, stormy piece of classical music that required two hands to work independently. Moving with a speed and precision that was hard to believe, Richard stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The smug smile had been wiped off his face, as if someone had taken an eraser to it. He stared at the boy, unable to process what he was seeing and hearing. He had expected a clumsy mess. He had expected a few sour notes and the awkward silence of a child giving up. But this was something else entirely. This was a level of skill that he usually only saw from the performers he paid hundreds of dollars to hire. The boy. Leo had his eyes closed. He wasn't looking at his hands. He wasn't looking at the keys. He seemed to be looking inward, staring at the music in his mind. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, his back straightening, his shoulders relaxing. The heavy, dirty hoodie suddenly didn't look like a rag anymore. It looked like the costume of a focused artist. The worn-out sneakers rested firmly on the pedals. Controlling the volume and the sustain of the notes with expert timing, Leo's hands moved across, the ivory keys like they were skipping over water. His left hand played a deep, throbbing rhythm, while his right hand danced up and down the high notes, playing a melody that was so fast it made the air shimmer. It was a difficult piece, full of emotion. It wasn't a happy song. It was a serious, heavy sound that told a story of struggle and triumph. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The shoppers who had been ignoring the scene were now magnetically drawn to the platform. A woman holding a cup of coffee stopped mid-stride, her eyes wide. A man who had been yelling into his phone lowered his voice and then hung up, turning to watch. Even the security guard, who had seen everything in this mall, stood up straight and took his earbuds out. A look of genuine amazement on his face. They weren't just watching because it was a kid playing. They were watching because it was good. It was genuinely, undeniably good. Richard felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was a mix of shock and a sinking feeling of regret. He looked at his expensive suit and then at the boy in the hoodie. He had judged this book by its cover, and he had been wrong. Terribly wrong. He remembered his cruel words, "Triple what you usually make," and he felt his face turn hot with embarrassment. If this boy was this good, he was worth a lot more than Richard could afford. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the mistake he had made. The music continued to swell. Leo hit a series of chords that were so powerful they seemed to shake the dust off the chandeliers. He was lost in the music now. He wasn't thinking about the cold outside or the hunger in his stomach or the angry man standing behind him. He was just a boy and his piano. For these few minutes, he wasn't poor or homeless or out of place. He was the master of this room. He was the one in control. He had the power to make hundreds of people stop and listen. A young girl, no older than 7, broke away from her mother's hand and walked closer to the stage. She stood near the edge, watching Leo's hands fly across the keys with wonder. Her mother started to pull her back, worried she was bothering the pianist. But then the mother saw Leo's face. She saw the peace there, the total concentration, and she stopped. She smiled softly and let her daughter watch. It was a moment of pure magic that no amount of money could buy. Richard was paralyzed. He knew he should do something. Should he stop him? Should he apologize? He felt rooted to the spot. He watched Leo's fingers. They were small and a bit red from the cold, but they moved with the strength of a giant. The manager realized that this wasn't just a hobby for this kid. This was his lifeline. This was how he survived in a world that was cruel to him. The piece Leo was playing was building to a climax. The notes got faster and louder. The sound was intense, filled with a rolling thunder of energy. The shoppers were completely captivated. People were pulling out their phones not to scroll, but to record. They held their phones up, capturing the silhouette of the boy in the green hoodie against the shiny black piano. It was a sight that belonged in a movie, not in a random Tuesday afternoon at a mall. The security guard looked at Richard, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Are you seeing this?" Richard couldn't even look at the guard. He just kept his eyes on the boy. He was trying to figure out where this talent came from. How often do you walk past a person on the street who has a gift like this? How many times had he ignored someone who could change the world with their hands? The music reached its peak. Leo's hands were a blur. He struck the final chords with a force that seemed to go through his whole body. Bum bum. The last note rang out, hanging in the air, vibrating and full of life. Leo held his hands over the keys for a second, letting the sound fade away naturally, his breathing heavy. Then he pulled his hands back and placed them in his lap. He opened his eyes. The trance was broken. For a second, there was absolute silence in the atrium. It was that heavy, expectant silence that happens after a great performance, where the audience is catching up with what they just heard. Then, all at once, the room exploded. The applause wasn't just polite clapping. It was loud. It was a roar. People were cheering and whistling. The young girl by the stage clapped her hands over her head. The woman with the coffee put her cup down on a nearest table to clap harder. A man in a business suit yelled, "Bravo!" The sound echoed off the glass walls, surrounding Leo. Leo sat on the bench, looking out at the crowd with a shocked expression. He wasn't used to this. He was used to playing in an empty auditorium or a dusty classroom. He wasn't used to hundreds of strangers clapping for him. A shy smile crept onto his face, turning his cheeks pink. He looked down at his sneakers, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Richard stood in the middle of the applause, feeling small. The sound of the clapping felt like it was washing over his ego, stripping it away. He looked at the smiling faces of the shoppers, the people he was supposed to be impressing, and they weren't impressed by the luxury goods or the marble floors. They were impressed by the boy he had tried to kick out. The manager took a deep breath. He had two choices. He could try to regain control, act like this was all part of the plan, and save his pride. Or he could do the right thing. He watched Leo slide off the bench, preparing to leave the stage, his head down again, as if he was trying to disappear. Leo stepped down from the platform, the applause still ringing in his ears. He pulled his hood up, shielding his face. He just wanted to slip away quietly before anyone changed their minds. He thought maybe the angry manager would yell at him again for playing too loud or for staying too long. He started to walk toward the exit, moving fast. "Wait," a voice said. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the crowd. Leo stopped walking. He didn't turn around immediately. He flinched, waiting for the hand on his shoulder, the rude comment. The security guard telling him to get lost. But when he turned, Richard wasn't standing with his arms crossed. He wasn't scowling. The manager was walking toward him slowly, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He didn't look arrogant anymore. He looked humbled. He looked like a man who had just learned a very expensive lesson. The crowd quieted down a little, watching to see what would happen next. Richard stopped a few feet away from Leo. He looked at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the tired eyes and the worn clothes, but he also saw the talent that had just filled his building with beauty. Richard started, then cleared his throat. His voice sounded different. It was softer. I was wrong. Leo looked up, surprised. The manager couldn't remember the last time he had admitted he was wrong to anyone, let alone a kid he didn't know. You are incredible, Richard said simply. I have never heard anything like that. He reached into his jacket pocket. He wasn't reaching for a wallet to give the kid a few dollars. He was reaching for his business card. But then he stopped. He realized that a business card wasn't enough. A card was for business deals. This was something bigger. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't angry anymore. It was a silence of respect. The shoppers watched, holding their breath. They could feel the shift in the air. The judgment had evaporated, replaced by admiration. The boy who had been an intruder 5 minutes ago was now the guest of honor. And the man who had been the king of the castle was now just a fan in the audience. The applause was starting to fade away, turning into a soft murmur of conversation, but the energy in the room felt different now. It wasn't the stiff, cold atmosphere of a luxury store anymore. It felt warm. It felt alive. People were smiling at each other, sharing a moment of connection that had nothing to do with how much money they had in their bank accounts. A few shoppers were still wiping tears from their eyes. Moved by the sudden beauty that had interrupted their busy day, Leo stood with his back against a pillar near the piano, trying to make himself as small as possible. He had pulled the strings of his hoodie tight, so only his eyes and nose were visible. He was breathing hard, his heart thumping against his ribs. The adrenaline of the performance was wearing off, and now he just felt exposed. He had poured his soul out into the music, and now that it was over, he felt empty and scared. He looked toward the glass doors. He wanted to run. He wanted to get back out into the cold air where things made sense, where nobody looked at him. He took a hesitant step toward the exit, keeping his head down. He expected the security guard to block his path. He expected the manager to start yelling again, telling him he owed money for touching the instrument or that he had caused a disturbance. That was how the world usually worked for Leo. Good things didn't last. They were just tricks of the light, and then reality came crashing back down. But the security guard didn't move. He just gave Leo a small nod, a sign of respect that the boy barely understood. Hey, wait. The voice came again, softer this time, but firm. Richard had closed the distance between them. He wasn't marching like he had before. He was walking with a strange sort of care, like he was approaching a wild animal that might get scared and run away. He stood in front of Leo, blocking the way to the door, but not in a threatening way. He stood there with his hands open, his palms up, showing he wasn't holding a weapon or a badge. Leo flinched but stopped walking. He looked up, his eyes wary. He waited for the shouting. He waited for the mocking to start again. I told you, Richard said, his voice low and sincere. I was wrong. I judged you by your clothes, and I was an idiot. Leo didn't say anything. He just blinked, unsure of how to react. Adults didn't talk to kids like this. They didn't apologize. You play like... Richard paused, struggling to find the right words. You play like you have a fire inside you. I haven't heard anything like that in this mall in 10 years. And I pay professional musicians a lot of money to stand right there on that stage. Richard reached into the pocket of his expensive suit jacket. Leo watched the hand, wondering if he was about to be handed a $5 bill like a beggar. That would have been humiliating. Richard pulled out a leather wallet, but instead of taking out cash, he took out a small, crisp business card. I don't have triple the money on me, Richard said with a dry chuckle. And honestly, giving you cash wouldn't be right. You don't need a handout. You need a stage. He held the card out to Leo. The boy hesitated for a long time before slowly reaching out a hand and taking it. The card was heavy, with raised black letters. It simply said, Manager, Galleria, Atrium, and a phone number. I want to hire you, Richard said, and the words hung in the air. Not just for today, for the weekend. Every Saturday and Sunday, I need music here. Real music. Not that boring nonsense they usually play. People loved listening to you. Look around. Leo glanced up. The shoppers were still nearby. A young woman gave him a thumbs up. An older man smiled and nodded. They weren't looking at him with disgust anymore. They were looking at him like he was somebody you pay. Leo asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. I pay good, Richard promised. Better than the other guys? And you don't have to stand out in the cold. You can come in the back, where it's warm. We'll get you a badge so security knows you belong here. Leo looked down at the card in his hand. It felt warm from Richard's pocket. It felt like a lifeline. He thought about his apartment, the cold rooms, the empty fridge. He thought about his mother worrying about rent. This wasn't just about playing the piano. This was about hope. But I don't have a suit, Leo said, looking down at his dirty sneakers. I look like this. Richard looked at the hoodie, the faded jeans, the worn shoes. Then he looked at the shiny piano behind him. You sounded like a king. The suit doesn't matter when you play like that. But, Richard added, a smile finally returning to his face, if you want to wear a suit, we can figure that out too. First things first. Can you come back tomorrow? Same time? Leo nodded. He couldn't find the words to speak. His throat felt tight, but in a good way this time. He nodded again, harder. Good, Richard said. He clapped a hand gently on Leo's shoulder. It was a fatherly gesture, warm and heavy. Now go get warmed up. There's a coffee shop around the corner. Go tell them I sent you. Get yourself a hot chocolate. Put it on my tab. I don't have money, Leo stammered. It's on the house, Richard said. Just tell them Richard from the piano sent you. Richard stepped aside and held the door open for him. Not the way out to the street, but the gesture was enough. It was an invitation to come back. Leo gripped the business card tight in his hand. He didn't run this time. He walked toward the exit with his head up just a little bit higher. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped back out into the cold wind. But the wind didn't feel as biting anymore. He pulled the hoodie strings tighter, but he was smiling. He walked around the corner of the building to the coffee shop. He was nervous again, but he walked inside. The smell of espresso and sugar hit him. He went up to the counter, the card in his sweaty hand. He told the woman behind the register what the manager had said. She looked at him, then at the card. A slow smile spread across her face. So you're the one, she said. We could hear the music from back here. It was beautiful. She didn't ask for money. She poured a large cup of hot chocolate piled high with whipped cream and handed it to him. Leo took the cup. The heat warmed his frozen fingers immediately. He took a sip, and the sweetness flooded his mouth. He sat by the window, looking out at the street. He watched the people rushing past in the cold, heads down, just trying to survive. He took another sip of the hot chocolate and looked at the business card on the table. Inside the mall, Richard was standing on the red platform. He was looking at the piano, waiting for his VIP client. A few minutes later, a tall, elegant woman walked in, surrounded by assistants. She looked around the quiet atrium. Where is the music? She asked, sounding disappointed. I was told there would be a pianist. Richard smiled, a real smile this time. He walked over to her with a confidence he hadn't felt an hour ago. There was a pianist, madam. He just finished. And I promise you, the show he put on was worth more than anything else in this building. He told her the story as they walked. He told her about the boy in the green hoodie. He didn't leave out the part where he had been rude. He told her the whole truth. By the time they reached the jewelry counter, the woman was smiling too. I want to hear him next time I visit, she said. Make sure he is here. You can count on it, Richard said. And outside in the warmth of the coffee shop, Leo finished his drink. He stood up, put the business card safely in his pocket, and zipped his hoodie up against the wind. He walked out the door heading home, but he wasn't walking into the darkness anymore. He was walking toward it tomorrow, where he would sit on that bench again, touch those keys, and finally be heard. The winter was still cold, but the future was bright.